Hey YouTube, Vinny M here, and welcome to another video here on the channel. Today we have another World War II history video for you, and in today's video we're going to be discussing the history of the U.S. Army Air Force Flight Officer rank during World War II. This is a rank that only existed during World War II and is completely misunderstood with a ton of myths about it. And in today's video we're going to be covering its history and getting rid of that misinformation. The first thing about this rank is that it is most commonly mistaken for a British rank. You say flight officer to somebody and people automatically assume you're talking about the Royal Air Force Flying Officer, which was the equivalent of a first lieutenant. That rank seen top right in this photo. But that is not the case. The Army Air Force Flight Officer was actually the equivalent of a Warrant Officer Junior grade. It was higher than a Master Sergeant but lower than a Second Lieutenant. Yet it was treated like a second lieutenant nonetheless. The flight officer rank was represented by these little navy blue ovals with a gold border and a horizontal gold line. The blue pill, as it is most commonly referred to. It came in both a patch form, as you can see here, and a metal pin form, which is actually more common. What's interesting is that we still sort of have this system of ranks today. We still have ranks that are higher than your highest enlisted, but lower than your lowest officer. And they still pretty much perform the same tasks that they did in World War II. Those are the warrant officers. Here's the modern warrant officer rank with warrant officer 1, and then your 4 chief levels, warrant officer 2 through 5, known as chief warrant officers. This is essentially the same system that existed in World War II. There was just not 5 of them, but instead 3. You may be saying, what do you mean there was 3? You've only mentioned the flight officer. Well, this is where the confusion starts. You see, there were actually 3 different versions of warrant officer rank. The flight officer was specific to flying positions in the U.S. Army Air Force. The warrant officer junior grade was the same rank as flight officer, but was typically seen in the ground forces, typically as someone filling a low-level officer billet or a technical specialist in their field. And then the chief warrant officer on the far left was the higher rank of the other 2, but almost never seen in the Air Corps. These ranks were established in 1941 by Public Law 230, which authorized the W1 warrant officer grade, known as the warrant officer junior grade, and the W2 warrant officer grade, known as the chief warrant officer. Notice that this doesn't really mention flight officer. That's because flight officer was actually added in 1942 and made an equivalency to the warrant officer junior grade. Now you may be wondering, why was that done? Why couldn't they just have the warrant officer junior grade? It's because the flight officer was specific to flying positions. See, a warrant officer junior grade could actually have authority. A flight officer, on the other hand, wasn't really supposed to have any. A flight officer's job was to perform a role on an aircraft, either a bombardier, a navigator, or a pilot. And it was created because we used to have sergeant pilots. Most people associate sergeant pilots with Great Britain, but I want you to look at this photo. This was during the transition phase when flight officer was coming around. The man in the middle is clearly a flight officer, but the man to his right is a master sergeant. And the man to the right is wearing Master Army Aviator wings. That's a set of aviator wings, pilot wings, with a wreath and a star. A Master Army Aviator as a master sergeant, because he was a sergeant pilot. And when the flight officer rank was created, he would have been changed over to a flight officer. You may be wondering, why was this an issue? Well, it's because doctrine of the time, and even doctrine today, states that the pilot with more time on the aircraft is the pilot that is in charge. A master sergeant like this guy, that's a Master Army Aviator that has hundreds of hours in an aircraft, would outrank a second lieutenant that had just graduated flight training to fly the same aircraft. There were a lot of people in the military that were not willing to accept the idea that a sergeant would outrank a lieutenant on board an aircraft where the sergeant had more time flying that aircraft. And thus, the flight officer position was created so that if somebody outranked an officer, without having a college degree. They would at least have officer in their title. So thanks to several high-ranking officers' total dismay at the prospect of a non-college educated enlisted man outranking a college-educated officer, we wound up with the flight officer position. They just could not fathom the idea that an enlisted man would outrank an officer just because he had flown an airplane for more hours than that officer had. This rank didn't mean they were college educated, but somehow this made it okay for them to be the equivalent or outrank an officer. Doesn't make any sense to me, but it made sense to somebody. If we look at the pay scale, though, you'll notice that while they claim the flight officer was actually lower than a second lieutenant, the pay was the same. If you look down here on the left, the second lieutenant made $1,800 a year, and the flight officer made $1,800 a year. You'll also notice that's the same pay that the warrant officer junior grade got. And you'll also notice, if you look closely, that the chief warrant officer made more than a first lieutenant. They made almost as much as a captain. I found that very interesting. So while it was said that even the chief warrant officer was still lower than a second lieutenant, he was making more than a first lieutenant. So the entire warrant officer scale is rather messed up in its entirety. And the messed up things do not end there. I want you to pay real close attention to those pay scales. Second lieutenant, $1,800. Flight officer, $1,800. Warrant officer junior grade, $1,800. Are you paying attention? Good. So the Army forgot to define overseas pay for warrant officers and flight officers. You see, if you look here, an enlisted man got a 20% overseas bonus, and an officer got 10%. They don't define what a warrant officer or a flight officer got. By default, they got the 20% enlisted rate. Guess what that means? The second lieutenant made $1,800 a year, and he got 10% bonus when he was deployed. The flight officer made $1,800 a year, but he got a 20% bonus when he was deployed because he got the enlisted overseas bonus. That means a flight officer made more than a college-educated commissioned officer that was doing the same exact job that he was. Now that's hard for a lot of people to believe, but it was just an oversight by the Army. Here, in an article from a website that discusses the history of this rank and how it turned into the modern warrant officer, we can see that it states that their $150 per month in basic pay was the same as a junior grade warrant officer or second lieutenant, that they got an additional $75 or half of basic pay as flight pay, but that they got a 20% overseas allowance versus an officer's 10%. It's simply oversight, and that's not where the oversight ends on the part of the Army. Flight officers made more deployed than a second lieutenant and had no responsibilities. Flight officers were typically pilots, bombardiers, and navigators, and all they had to do was their job on the aircraft. A second lieutenant might be over latrine duty or other responsibilities on the ground, could be over mess or recreation, things like that, and had direct reports to them within the ranks of the unit. Flight officers had none of that. They got paid more money while overseas to do nothing but their job with zero responsibility and zero direct reports to them. Now that we've talked about the pay, we've talked about the authority, and we've talked about the oversights by the Army in regards to these positions, let's talk about how you can identify a flight officer in a period photo. If you look at the flight officer rank and the warrant officer junior grade rank, in black and white, you notice they are nearly identical. So how can we tell them apart in a period photo? What is this guy? He's a warrant officer junior grade. How do I know that? I can't tell if that pill on his hat is brown or if it's blue. I know that for two reasons. He has warrant officer collar brass under the U.S. letters on his collar, and he does not have a set of wings. Flight officers were always in a flying position. They should always have wings on the chest of their dress uniform. Either navigator, pilot, bombardier, service pilot, glider pilot, liaison pilot, or some like position. If we look at a different uniform, we see that this person is a service pilot, we see they do not have warrant officer collar brass. They have props and wings under the U.S. letters. This is a flight officer. On the hat, you will sometimes see the warrant officer hat brass, but not always, because flight officers were authorized to wear the warrant officer hat brass or the commissioned officer hat brass. It was up to them. Here we see an example of that, a flight officer in the 20th Air Force, a B-29 Bombardier, who chose to wear the commissioned officer hat brass rather than the warrant officer hat brass. If we look at other existing dress uniforms, we see these trends I've talked about carried out time and time again. We have props and wings and U.S. letters on this uniform here, and we have the flight officer insignia on the shoulders. This uniform should have a set of wings, but it's an existing uniform that probably just had them removed, which is a common issue with existing uniforms. If they are not wearing their jacket, you would typically see the props and wings on the left collar and the blue pill on the right collar. The Army Air Force did not have a standard practice of wearing wings on shirts, so you may or may not see them. As with all things World War II, though, these uniforms aren't without their oddities. Here is a warrant officer junior grade assigned to the Air Force. That's an Army Air Force patch on the left shoulder. But they don't have the wings and prop. They have the rising eagle of the warrant officer as their collar insignia and no wings. This person wasn't a pilot. They were simply a warrant officer junior grade assigned to the Army Air Force. Remember what I said about how flight officers were always flight positions? So it would stand to reason that if they needed a warrant officer in a ground position, they would use the warrant officer rank rather than the flight officer rank. And we do see a few instances like that, such as this uniform. Here we have yet another example of the same thing. We have a warrant officer junior grade in the Army Air Force, but they are not an air crew. They have no air crew wings, no awards that would indicate that they were air crew, and they do not have the wing and prop collar insignia. They have the rising eagle of the warrant officer. Here we have a uniform that is very clearly a flight officer. We have the wings and props on the collar instead of the warrant officer insignia, and we have a set of aviation wings on the chest. So the general rule is if it has warrant officer collar brass, it's a warrant officer. If it has wings and props, it's a flight officer. If it has wings on the chest, it's a flight officer. If it doesn't, it's a warrant officer. Not quite always the case, as with this example here, but this is a pretty outlandish example. This is a warrant officer, has warrant officer hat brass, warrant officer collar brass. It still fits the mold of what I've told you. I told you warrant officer collar brass should be a warrant officer. Wings and props should be a flight officer, right? This person is a pilot. They have a Distinguished Flying Cross and an Air Medal. They are a chief warrant officer, providing that this uniform was not altered. I have no proof that it was, nor any proof that it wasn't. It's allegedly authentic. I have never heard of a chief warrant officer being in a pilot billet, but it's not impossible. Technically, chief warrant officer would be a promotion from flight officer, but more commonly, flight officers were promoted directly to second lieutenant. That was actually the norm. So there can always be exceptions to the rule, but I've gave you the best I can to get you set up for success in identifying period photos. Now that we know how to spot these guys in period photos, let's talk about their job role. Here is a glider pilot mannequin display that I made for a D-Day event. It's the 437th Troop Carrier Squadron on D-Day. You notice the blue pill painted on the helmet. That comes from original photographs such as this one. You also notice the glider wings on the chest, which also is seen in original photographs. The flight officer is most associated with the glider pilot role. However, that is grossly incorrect. It is totally an assumption. The glider force had about 6,000 glider pilots trained by the end of the war. Not all of them were flight officers. However, at the end of the war, there were 32,500 flight officers on active duty, and it's believed that nearly 200,000 flight officer ranks were issued during the war. When we look at other photographs from other types of units, such as this photo from the 306 bomb group, we see warrant officer insignia on officer aircrew, both of the guys at the bottom right. That's because they're flight officers. We see this in multiple photos in bomb groups as well as other types of flying force, such as troop transports like your C-47s or your C-46s. Pretty much any flying position that was slotted for an officer could be filled by a flight officer. Here we see another 306 bomb group photo, and that man on that bottom row, second from the left, is a flight officer. So when you think of flight officer, what you should be thinking instead of glider pilot is any flying officer. Pilot, liaison pilot, service pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, etc. Now that we've talked about the positions that these flight officers could fill, we need to understand that the position that they filled didn't always go with the rank that they had. We've already talked about how a flight officer outranked a master sergeant but was lower than a second lieutenant. But when on board an aircraft, that wasn't the case. They could actually fill positions that were equivalent up to about a captain. Here we have a document from the 437th Troop Carrier Squadron on D-Day. They were the unit that landed the 80th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, which was a component of the 82nd Airborne Division. They did so via glider in Drop Zone O. Here is a list of all of their aircraft and their crews. You notice glider number 4256304 has Flight Officer Edward A. Ryan Jr. as pilot in command, and his co-pilot is First Lieutenant Paul A. Tisdale. This is an example of a flight officer outranking a first lieutenant in a combat setting on D-Day during the Second World War. What we have to understand, as I've already mentioned, is that in the Air Corps, experience was typically seen as more important than your actual rank. So this flight officer probably had a lot more time flying gliders than that first lieutenant, and thus was put as pilot in command due to his experience. A lot of people would like to assume that if a flight officer was on board, say, a B-17, that they would probably be the navigator or the bombardier, maybe even the co-pilot, but that the ship would be commanded by probably a first lieutenant. However, as crews had gigantic losses in combat, this became not the case. A flight officer could be the pilot in command with a second lieutenant as his co-pilot, a second lieutenant as his navigator, and a second lieutenant as his bombardier. And there are documents that show this happening. It's not extremely frequent among the bomb groups like it is among gliders and transport aircraft, but it did happen. And every unit, it happened at a different frequency. So if you really want to know how often it happened where a flight officer outranked a commissioned officer, you would have to dive into the actual documents for each mission for each unit that you wanted to know about. Now, there are some very famous flight officers I want to cover as we wrap the video up. This is Gene Autry. He was a country music singer, and I also believe he was an actor. He originally started as one of those roughly 2,000 and some change pilot sergeants that we had at the beginning of the war. He was a master sergeant. He was then transferred to the rank of flight officer, and you can see here he chose to wear commissioned officer insignia. But if we go down to his shoulder, we see he has the blue pill, as well as troop carrier command insignia on his shoulder. So he was a flight officer in a troop carrier unit. After the war, he would become very famous as an entertainer. And he's one of those people that most people have no idea that he was ever a pilot sergeant nor a flight officer. Another person that most people have no clue about the history of is Chuck Yeager, the pilot that broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1. He was originally also a pilot sergeant, became a flight officer when the rank was created, and was later commissioned as an actual commissioned officer, with the final rank of Brigadier General in the United States Air Force. Ultimately, the flight officer position gets overlooked and is entirely misunderstood. And due to that, this video was created to help you understand the rank, positions, and authority that it carried. That's all I have for you guys. As always, like and subscribe, and have a nice day. And if you're curious, this is me.